Welcome to the second March 20th, 2025 episode of the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today the working title for the show is British Columbia's response to the tariff threat worse than Donald Trump? I don't know that anything's worse than Donald Trump, but maybe we're getting close. My guest is Professor Stewart Prest of the Political Science Department of the University of British Columbia. So welcome to the show, Stewart.
Thanks. Very good to be with you.
Well, look, I haven't talked to you for a long time, and we want to rectify that because I think these kinds of political issues and questions are going to be coming up more and more. It just seems like the political systems in the two countries are unsettled, and there's a lot of change going on, and people want to know what's up. Now, I yesterday I read a piece by Rob Shaw, who's a political reporter in Vancouver and reasonably well respected. And he said that Bill 7, introduced by Premier David Eby and the NDP, was, quote, the most extraordinary piece of legislation tabled in the province since the Second World War. That really got my attention. So just maybe give us your general take on Bill 7.
Sure. So Bill 7 is essentially if you like, a version of a War Measures Act passed by, or to be passed by, proposed by the BC government, empowering cabinet to act in a variety of ways without the oversight of the legislature. And so it has an expansive list of different areas, everything from tolls to different kinds of economic regulations, where normally they would require some kind of legislative amendment or change to the statutes in the province. It empowers cabinet to enact directives simply on the authority of cabinet, which, if there is any kind of discrepancy between standing legislation and then the direction cabinet wants to go, cabinet wins out. And so while it preserves the fundamental check on authority, that is responsible government and the need to maintain the confidence of the legislature, and essentially on the issues that the legislation touches, turns cabinet into a version of the legislature. And so that really empowers the NDP to make decisions, supposedly because of the need to act rapidly to respond to the threat of tariffs and to put in place countermeasures and to be nimble in our response as a province, but comes at the expense of democratic oversight within the legislature.
Well, look, there's a big debate going on down in the US about Donald Trump because clearly he's trying to aggregate more power to the executive. So there's three branches, the executive, Congress, and the judiciary. He's ignored a judge's order already. He he's kind of running amok. It really is what he's doing. But Shaw made the point that in a way, Eby and the NDP have almost given themselves more power than Trump has. What do you think?
So I would not go so far as to say that, because I think Donald Trump is acting in a way that is clearly extra constitutional, unconstitutional. He is disregarding congressional powers. Congress, for its part, doesn't seem keen to enforce its constitutional powers, but we also see the administration openly defying judicial findings of judicial review. So this is not that. But what we have instead here is a reality that the executive in our parliamentary system is by design, actually, in some sense, more powerful than the executive in the U.S. system, where the executive has to negotiate with Congress to enact any kind of legislative changes, to enact budgets, and so on. They have this system of checks and balances. In the parliamentary system, executive and legislature are fused, and so as long as government maintains a responsible government, it can do all kinds of things. What this step is doing essentially is removing the legislature from that legislative oversight, its role in passing legislative changes, and simply saying cabinet is going to act as if the legislature has already agreed to these changes. The irony here is that you don't really need to do that to enact changes and quick changes within the parliamentary system, because the government already has the confidence of the legislature, and so you'd have to ensure that you have a majority vote. But NDP has a narrow but real majority, buttressed by the Green Party, so it already has this power. What this really is doing is sidelining the legislature as a locus of action and sidelining the opposition as a consequence.
We're seeing this in other provinces, where premiers are flexing their muscles, and we saw Doug Ford threaten to shut off electricity to the United States. That was interesting. More of a political move, I think, than anything, to get a response from the Americans. But over in Alberta, where Premier Danielle Smith since 2022 has been had the ongoing feud with the federal government. And she's looking at passing changes to I think it's the Critical Infrastructure Act that would actually prohibit federal employees from going on oil and gas leases and collecting data, which seems like a little tiny thing, but in terms of jurisdictional authority is a big thing. And we'll see if that survives the courts, and because no doubt it'll be challenged. But is there a new trend here where provinces are trying to accumulate more power to themselves in response to Trump?
I think that that's a real possibility that we're going to see more of these kinds of actions, and the motives may change. I think in Alberta's case, it's pretty clear that there is a desire to defend provincial jurisdiction and extend provincial jurisdiction, and really to effectively dare the federal government in a number of ways to actually try to stand up for the margins of its jurisdictional authority over things like environmental regulation. These are murky areas where province and federal government both have some role to play. And so I think this is part of an ongoing attempt to carve out space for Alberta. And in the case of BC's legislation here, it is more directly as a response to Donald Trump, but it does have that same kind of effect of trying to insulate further a provincial government from one of the checks that are placed on it. In this case, the need to have statutory changes passed by the legislature. And I think this is the kind of thing that can badly backfire actually on provincial governments where they are seen to be not acting in behalf of constituents, but rather seeking to avoid either constitutional checks or, in the case of Alberta, or avoid the accountability to the opposition and by extension the people of British Columbia. And so that creates a number of hazards for this government. There's a temptation to simply make changes without really engaging in process of consultation, and essentially propose bills that are flawed, or propose changes that are flawed, are much more likely to become the law of the land, and proposed mistakes become mistakes in reality, and the government will end up wearing the consequences of those. And so they are exposing themselves to a number of risks here, I think.
Just before we came on, I was reading a press release from Danielle Smith in Alberta, where she had a conversation with Carney, Prime Minister Carney, on the phone, and then she said that this was, the press release was her response to it, and there was a long line. I think it might have been 10 demands to reduce federal overreach. And the one that really stood out for me, because it does affect BC, because if there are going to be pipelines, they're going to go west from Alberta. They're not going to go east. So, and what she said, what she demanded of the federal government is oil and gas corridors to the west, to the east, to the north that were unfettered. Unfettered. And I'd never seen that language before, because basically what it says is steamroller over BC. We don't care what BC thinks about a pipeline to it or pipelines to its coast. And is that just a negotiating ploy, a rhetorical, political ploy? Because if she's serious, I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, we can clearly read it as a kind of negotiating ploy, and an advancement and an enlargement on previous calls for energy corridors across the country, saying we need to be serious about building additional infrastructure of various kinds, but most controversially, pipelines in different directions. And I think this is clearly a non-starter. You can't simply erase the need to consult with other jurisdictions affected by a decision. You can't simply say we're going to set aside obligations to Indigenous peoples, to other provinces. We can't simply erase the federal government's need to to ensure the environmental viability of projects. These are all that cross provincial boundaries. These are all obligations that must continue to be met. What the federal government could perhaps do is put in place much more streamlined processes to engage in consultations and so on. But a crisis is not a reason to simply put aside the constitutional rights of other people, but rather to look for new ways to solve these problems.
Yeah, that raises another question. The first episode I did today was about the open letter that the oil and gas industry sent to the federal government 2 days ago. And one of the things that it asked for in there, I mean, aside from, the removal of legislation like Bill C-69, the Environmental Impact Act, Bill C-48 about the tanker ban off Northwest BC, but it also said we want a guarantee from the day that a company submits a proposal, there will be an approval in 6 months. I mean, there's an environmental impact assessment that has to go on.
Right.
There are Section 35 constitutional consultations required of Indigenous communities, of Aboriginal peoples. There will, if you were to build a pipeline out to the West Coast, there would be enormous political opposition. And that demand from within the context of this conversation was really quite extraordinary.
And again, that kind of demand is tantamount to saying proposals are not proposals. Essentially, there has to be a guarantee that anything asked for is granted within 6 months, because sometimes the answer has to be no, but much more often the answer is this is complicated and we have to attend to a variety of issues before we can say yes. And if you demand an answer in 6 months, then the answer is more likely to be no as a result, because you're not going to have time to deal with all these issues. And if the federal government does not deal with them in their initial assessment and creation of spaces for consultation and review, the courts will force them to do so. They have done so in the past around things like Trans Mountain, and so those precedents are set. And simply because the situation politically, geopolitically is changing, it does not set aside those constitutional obligations.
Is this a case where groups that have had long-standing beefs with the federal government or with other provinces now see a crisis arising, or it's a kind of in a way an existential crisis for Canada, because since Trump wants to annex us, and they see the opportunity to advance their agenda that maybe they didn't make any progress before, and is that what we're seeing here? And are we likely to see it in other provinces?
I mean, we're seeing a lot of things. I don't think we can isolate it as any one thing. Certainly one of the phenomena that we're seeing is that there are many people who see any crisis as an opportunity, and it's often notable that people will point to a new crisis, a new situation, as a fresh reason to do what they had been asking for all along. And so we do see that kind of opportunism certainly at work. But I think the bigger issue here is that we are seeing a fundamental fracturing of the response to the threat posed by Donald Trump and the United States, both in the conversation around tariffs, but also the larger conversation around annexation, where the significant majority of the country sees a crying need and a fundamental need to pull together and present a steadfast opposition to the threats of tariffs and the talk of annexation, saying we need to stand up for Canada, whatever the cost. And then a subset of the population, and I associated with that more right of center populist movement, is continually questioning that strong response, and instead looking for ways to try to advance a different kind of agenda, which I think in the long term is still bending towards finding ways to realign with the United States. There is a strong desire, and we saw it in the strategies of Premier Smith in going to Mar-a-Lago in the earlier days of the threat cycle to try to say basically, hey, we're like you, we're on your side in this polarized divide. And I don't think that instinct has gone away. There's a desire to be part of the Trump movement, find ways to realign. And things like energy politics is really where the rubber hits the road on these issues.
Well, while I've got you here, I have to ask you a question, because this again arose out of the open letter from the oil and gas industry. Because what it wanted was the federal government to declare an energy crisis and then use the Emergency Powers Act. And they didn't mention specifically the Emergency Powers Act, but it was very clear to me anyway, reading it, that that's what they were talking about. So you know, for our American viewers and Eastern Canadian viewers, I mean, that's the legislation that the federal government used to clear out the convoy protesters in 2022. It's extraordinary. I mean, that is not used very often, and it's not used but now they want to use it to force pipelines and LNG plants and other energy infrastructure. I frankly, my jaw dropped when I read that. I couldn't believe that they would advocate for that, and that clearly is unconstitutional, or it's unlikely to be that the federal government would agree, I would
R-
think.
Right. It is unlikely the government would agree. A different way to phrase it is it's an attempt to use one of the constitutionally apportioned powers that allow for the federal government to override provincial areas of jurisdiction in the name of peace, order, and good government. But those powers have been tightly constrained by successive court decisions, such that things like national concern, a clear demonstration of national concern, or an emergency are the only circumstances when the federal government can employ those constitutional resources, and so that is an example of that kind of opportunism, looking for a way to spin the current situation as a reason to do what these interested groups have wanted to do all along. And I think to bring this conversation back full circle, it does really underline the potential dangers that crop up as soon as we start using language of emergency and enactment of emergency powers, whether at the provincial or federal level, because it raises the risk of running roughshod over these long-honed constitutional compromises that are frustrating to Canadians, but they also exist because of the different interests among Canadians, and we I think we meddle with those at our peril, and we must, if we are to do so, we must do so in a considered way that is in keeping with principles of constitutional government and the rule of law.
It seems to me, Stuart, that we're facing a number of crises. One is, of course, is all of the provinces are looking south. How do they respond? They take alcohol and other American products off their shelves. And Eby said that the first thing he was going to do with Bill 7, the new powers, was put a surcharge on American trucks going up through to Alaska. Alaska wasn't happy about that. So there's that conflict, north and south. But then there's also seems to be the potential here for increased conflict east and west
Yeah.
between just like with Alberta as an example.
Yeah, I think it's partly east and west, but it also is, if you like, I see there's two cross-cutting fundamental divides in the country. One is in terms of identity. Are you Canadian? Are you standing up for Canada? How do you view the U.S. threat? But the other one is that polarized divide that really shaped politics of the last decade or so. The sense of there being a right to center group, that up to a third of the country that really sees the world through this more populist lens, and really identifies with that kind of politics. And then two-thirds of the country that really tends to be more progressive in orientation around issues like everything from action on the environment to the response to COVID and on down the line. That fault line crops up again and again. And I think what we are seeing is a real competition in terms of what kinds of identities do Canadians ultimately hew to. That sense of a national unifying identity to stand against the threat of the United States, or is it that sense of a one side or other of the polarized political divide between a more populist way of doing politics and this more mainstream, institutionally focused approach that has historically been the default in Canada.
Let's wrap up the interview this way, Stuart. Given the fact that I think the whole country is expecting Prime Minister Carney to call an election on Monday, it'll be 6 weeks. It'll be April 28th or May 5th. And heading into it, what do you think I mean, obviously the top theme will be, the threat from Trump, annexation, tariffs, economic pressure, and so on. How do you think this is going? Oh, and I should mention also, again, for American viewers, for a long time, the Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives at the federal level, was leading by a very, very wide margin. And in a short period of time, 2 months, now the Liberals are leading. And what do you make of that, and how might it affect the coming election campaign?
Well, I think it goes back to just those divides we were talking about. Pierre Poilievre won 2024. He won it in a knockout, and he took out Justin Trudeau as leader. Ultimately, that was the prize he won. He did not win an election because there was no election to be won in 2024. He won it using something like the carbon tax and then building an entire campaign around the idea that these institutions we were just talking about are out of touch with the interests of Canadians, that things like the carbon tax are driving up costs and making things less affordable to Canadians, that government is out of touch with Canadians, essentially bringing that populist message to a mainstream audience and doing so very effectively. But now in 2025, the page has turned and a number of things have changed. Above all, we have this new threat from the United States emerging, which has fundamentally reshaped the way Canadians view politics. They are not worried and frustrated about what the federal government is doing to affect affordability. They are worried about Donald Trump and what Donald Trump could do to this country. And so their question is not what will this government do about affordability and these infernal institutions that are getting in the way of us, everyday folks. They're saying, what is this government going to do to protect us from the threat of tariffs and the threat of annexation? And Pierre Poilievre does not seem to have a really effective answer to that in the way that someone like Mark Carney clearly does. Mark Carney says he will do everything he can to defend Canadian independence, and Canadians believe him. Uh, Mr. Poilievre talks about things like wanting to make Canada strong and wanting to find ways to defend the border and so on. But his message repeatedly aligns up with Donald Trump's in ways that I think are hard for him to fully step away from. The rhetoric is very similar: Canada strong, make America great again, all that kind of thing. But also the message, making Canada strong to crack down on fentanyl at the border. That is very much saying we're going to do what the president is demanding that Canada does. And so he can't make the strong case of Canadian independence because his core supporters don't want that. And meanwhile, that larger majority of that mainstream, more progressive side of the population clearly does. And so I think as long as the ballot box question is about who is going to stand up more fully to Donald Trump, Mr. Carney has an advantage. The risk, though, is that Mr. Carney comes across as such an out of touch elite person that it reignites that more populist anger and starts to move some folks in the mainstream back towards that more populist side. And I think when we have debates regarding Mr. Carney's wealth, his investment portfolio, and the protections that are built in to avoid conflicts of interest, he is going to have to find ways to very clearly communicate that he is aware of those concerns and that he is very much in touch with the interests of Canadians and not appear defensive about his entitlements, as it were, because that's the surest path to a Liberal defeat.
Well, thank you very much, Stewart. Good to see you again. And no doubt with the election coming up, we'll have you on again in the short order. So until then, thank you.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.